Good evening, and welcome to St. Ignatius Parish's Adult Faith Formation Fall Speaker Series, Encountering Vatican II, Living into the Council with Francis. We especially welcome all of those joining us online and the generous donors whose support has made this series possible. My name is Lisa Fries, and I am the Director of Faith Formation here at St. Ignatius. Tonight, we welcome our fourth speaker, Professor Dr. Jeanette Rodriguez, to speak with us about Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church. Dr. Rodriguez is a professor at Seattle University, where she teaches in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and the Couples and Family Therapy program. She serves as director of the Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture and holds the Malcolm and Mari Stamper Endowed Chair in Catholic Intellectual and Cultural Traditions. Rodriguez is the author of several books and articles concentrated in the areas of U.S. Hispanic theology, theologies of liberation, peace building, and women's spirituality. At the turn of the millennium, along with Joan Chittister, Kathleen Norris, and Monica Helwig, and a dozen other feminist theologians, Dr. Rodriguez developed and signed the Madaleva Manifesto, a message of hope and courage at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. Dr. Rodriguez is a licensed marriage and family therapist in Washington State and here in California. She's an American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy approved supervisor. Dr. Rodriguez specializes in Latinx health and wellness and justice-oriented therapy. She holds a PhD in religion and the personality sciences from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Tonight, we are thrilled to have her here with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeanette Rodriguez.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this dark, cold evening. I really appreciate it. So I want to thank the planners and the organizers for this series. It's a wonderful series. You've had 3 great speakers, I understand. I also want to welcome those who are watching us on video and the ones who are in some room back there and all of you. So let's begin. Okay, slide 1, great. So by this 4th session, we've come to confirm that the Second Vatican Council looms as the most important theological event in the 20th century, right? We all agree to that? Yes. And yet, in its 60th year, the work of Vatican II remains a contested territory. For some Catholics, the Council was the beginning of a period of rising moral ambiguity and disunity. And these Catholics look back to a period of supposedly a greater consensus, more certitude. But for those of us who are inspired by that vision, the Council represented an overdue and essential reorientation of the Church, opening it up to a greater engagement with the modern world and with the global community. Next. Next. So my question for us this evening to think about is the Second Vatican Council, and specifically its pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, still relevant today, 57 years after the Council closed in 1965? So that's what we're going to be thinking about. Next. Just in case you didn't know who the protagonists are, and forgive me, sometimes I don't know if I'm writing in English or Spanish, so I think this is in Spanish. But these are the protagonists. So set in Rome and convened by a supposedly interim pope, this event assembled the largest ever group of bishops, theologians, and advisors to reflect and renew a world religion and its future in a changing society. Following 2 world wars that disrupted the order established by Western European monarchs, Vatican II sparked research and hope in scholars and lay leaders and vowed religious communities. Contemporary with the civil rights women's movement of North America in the 1960s, the emancipation movements of colonial governments, liberation movements in Latin America, this council fueled new energy towards examining the meaning of Christian religious belief in the midst of a deeply transforming world. And we find ourselves, again, in another context where we have to review, we have to find ourselves once again reflecting. You know, whenever there's a crisis, it's a great opportunity to return to the founding documents, I think, right? And we are in crisis, just in case we're not aware of that, right? Next. The council inspired major religious movements, as I said, that extended the responsibility for discipleship to all the baptized. So it increased a Catholic understanding of what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. And the documents released by the council invited experimentation and hope towards opening the doors of the Roman Catholic Church towards the contemporary era in which it existed. It rejected this closed, anti-modernist disposition of previous hierarchical authorities. Pope John XXIII, in collaboration with 2,500 bishops and approximately 25 women, and several ecumenical consultants, they opened the windows to let the Spirit in. And many significant changes emerged from this experimental nature of the immediate post-council church. So I want to lift up what I think is 6 concilial shifts. Next. So 1, television. Because we had television coverage, it allowed people to witness the incredible diversity of culture and ethnic origin represented in these conversations that took place over the 4 years of council deliberations. Next. Second, the council situated the major role of discipleship on you, the laity. The council documents spoke increasingly about the people of God, we who are church, the community of believers, the universal discipleship of the baptized. Third, the council fathers recognized an absence of a voice among over half of the participants in the local churches. Guess who they were? Just kidding. One, Cardinal Swenson, requested the presence of women at all future sessions. And one woman, she was a U.S. woman, Sister Mary Luke Tobin of the Sisters of Loretta, joined other women influencing the content of major documents. And while only 25 women served at the council events, they made major impacts on some key documents that set the stage and hope for future deliberation. In particular, Gaudium et Spes and the document on the laity. Fourth, the council invited major Protestant ordained ministers, Jews, Orthodox bishops to participate as witnesses to the conversation. And like the women and the theological advisors, these representatives influenced council documents through their conversation with participants before, during, and after the council sessions. Fifth, the council addressed issues of spiritual formation and community worship through its constitution on the sacred liturgy. I believe it was last session you had this great speaker on liturgy, yes? So this document produced a discussion that transformed the liturgical life of the church post-council by what? Moving the celebrant closer to the community, requiring the community to be present at worship, changing the language, to match the culture, and by doing so, and by becoming a little bit more exposed to different languages and different cultures, again, it expanded our insight and our understanding, and provided a conceptual space to think things differently. So, for example, in English, at your masses, when you go to mass in English, right, the priest prays for unity, right? He said, and let us pray, and we pray for unity, right? Yes? The liturgy? Yeah. But in Spanish, we say in that same section, unidos oremos, which means united we pray. So the presupposition is that we're already united and we're going to pray together, right? All right. Okay, 6. The council released a document on the freedom of conscience. This document states clearly that all baptized have a personal responsibility to seek instruction in their faith in order to make ethical choices. So these 6 major shifts in understanding fostered hope and experimentation throughout the world. Bishops in most countries formed synods that met occasionally to coordinate how Catholic Christian discipleship might be best lived within the cultural context, right? So this birthed, for example, the liberation movement in Latin America. So we have, so try to imagine this, you have the Vatican II Council with 3,000 people, let's say. They're invited to go back to their home countries and or continents, Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, and to reflect, right, on the vision and the movement of the Spirit that came out of Vatican II into their home countries, given the lived reality of their people. What came out of that, especially, and I'll talk about Latin America because that's what I know best, but what came out of that was that Latin America, the reflection that happened in Latin America, provided both the church and the discipline of theology new language in theology, like all of a sudden we're talking about institutionalized violence. We're talking about social sin. We're talking about option for the poor, right? A preferential option for the poor, right? So these were, I think what we have to understand is that we became a global church. And as such, the gifts, need to be seen and received. There has to be an intercambio, an exchange, a mutual exchange of these gifts. Sometimes I think that we in the United States have a very narrow view of our tradition, right? And it's only in dialogue with others that we really find how expansive the repository is. We have a 2,000-year repository of knowledge and wisdom, right? But I think we just tap the surface in any one place, right? Next. So Gaudium et Spes, actually it's one of my favorite documents, right? And it's one of the 4 constitutions resulting from the council. It was the last and longest published document from the council and is the first constitution published by an ecumenical council to address the entire world. It clarified and reoriented the role of the church's mission to people outside of the Catholic faith as well. So it was, and so you'll hear, for example, Francis talk about, to his constituency, the Catholics and to people of goodwill. You've heard that phrase, right? In an attempt to try to be more open. It was the first time that the church took explicit responsibility for its role in the larger church, and the Constitution's creation was necessitated by fear of the church's irrelevance in the modern era. Sometimes I feel like we're there again, right? Like thinking about how do we make our tradition relevant, right? So with the failure of the church to respond promptly or appropriately to major global events at that time, such as World War II or the Holocaust, Pope John XXIII began Vatican II with an emphasis on examining the role of the church in the world. And this culminated with the creation of Gaudium et Spes to address the role of the church. During the creation of the document itself, Gaudium et Spes went through multiple versions of schemas to reflect the idea that Pope John XXIII wanted to achieve during that council. And after a long debate during the council over Gaudium et Spes, the document came to cover a wide range of topics. And I'm not going to go through all those topics, but just to lift them up. Topics like marriage and family, the development of culture, economics, politics, peace and war. Together, the dogmatic constitution of the church, Lumen Gentium, and the pastoral, next, I forgot. Okay, World Church, okay, sorry, next, I forgot. I'm usually click my own PowerPoint, so. the Gaudium et Spes document called for us to read the signs of the times. You know that phrase, signs of the times. In Latin America, we say it's important to have a Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, right? And not just one newspaper. They read 2 or 3 newspapers, right? Because how does one discern what is true, right? So the importance of discernment, we draw from our Jesuit tradition, right, to help us with that one. So these 2 documents then, the Lumen Gentium and Gaudium et Spes, Lumen Gentium treats the nature of the church in itself, and Gaudium et Spes looks at its mission in the world, right? And remember, it was, many of you probably were taught this in your own religious formation, right? Here's the world, right? And here's heaven, and here's the church, and the church is a bridge between the world and heaven. Do you remember that? Yeah. After Vatican II, we're told, no, the church is in the world, right? But not of it, right? So what does that mean? That's going to take another few years to unpack a little bit. Let me see. Next. Oh, there's my 2 pillars, okay? Any contemporary vision of Catholic thought that claims to be progressive and forward-looking must trace its roots to the thinking of John Paul XXIII and the work of the Second Vatican Council. So Gaudium et Spes, as I have here on the PowerPoint, articulated the following. Number 1, that the church must be concerned with all of the human condition, material as well as spiritual, and Christians are responsible for what happens in the world. I want to go even further and say there are consequences for not just for what we do, but for what we don't do. And I want to repeat that. There's consequences for what we do and what we don't do, right? Number 2, that material goods must be used for the benefit of all. Francis has been echoing this a lot in his writings, right? Number 3, all social institutions must serve the human person and the centrality of the human dignity of the person, right? And 4, economic injustice is a cause of war. Immense economic inequalities must be removed. Advanced nations must help developing nations. It is with this reality of the modern world that the Church, united in council, wanted to enter into contact, reaffirming her awareness of being the sacrament of Christ, the light of the nations, as Lumen Gentium talks about, putting herself in a devout listening to the Word of God in the document of Deo Verbum, and recognizing as her own the joys and the hopes, Gaudium et Spes, of the people of our times. Imagine for the church, all right, our tradition of faith, to really be concerned not with just our soul and the afterlife, but with what we care about, our hopes, our dreams, our struggles, our aspirations, our mistakes, right? Our longing for purpose, for meaning, so that our children are not hurt, right? That they grow up healthy. The church, as we know it, was transformed, we know this from history, from being a Jewish sect into a great Western institution. And as a result of the extension of Christianity into the sphere of Roman and Hellenistic culture, faith and ways Christians talked about God were fundamentally reshaped. And it will continue to be reshaped with every reflection of the faith in different contexts. So what I find as exciting as what happened during the council, as I mentioned earlier, is when the bishops went out to their various continents and reflected on these themes, as I mentioned earlier. Next. So, for example, Salem is the Council of Episcopal Latin American Bishops, right? Salem, to make it short, no? But when they gathered, for example, in Medellin in 1968 in Colombia, this is some of the themes that came out. I told you some of the language that was new: institutionalized violence, preferential option for the poor, social sin. But also, we have the concept of base communities, comunidades de base, the importance, and if ever we needed it now, after the pandemic, right? With people feeling so isolated, right? Or how do we form these communities of faith, these house churches, domestic churches, what they used to be called, right? What also came out of Latin America was a methodology of doing social analysis that was rooted in faith. So the ver, juzgar, actuar, to see, to judge, to act. Are you all familiar with this methodology? No? Okay. If you're in a university setting, you would hear language like analysis, social analysis, theological reflection, right, and planning. So in Latin America, because to get to the church, it was so far, what they would do is identify key leaders in the various communities, right? Bring them in, train them, and have them go out. And then they would go to their home communities, and they would use this methodology. So to see, ver, they would say, what's going on in our community right now? Okay, let's say we don't have water in our community. Okay, so that's the reality. That's the reality, right? Ver. Juzgar, it's a terrible translation, to judge. What it really means, by what criteria do you make sense of this reality? That's the question. Based on your faith, based on scripture. So people will say, okay, we have no water, but Jesus is the water. He promised us water, living water. Therefore, we must have a right for water. So then we should organize to get water, right? Ver, juzgar, y actuar, and then to act. Okay, let's go talk to the commissioner or the governor or whatever and argue for water. So this process, right, was the methodology that existed in the small-based Christian communities. Next. In Latin America, when I first started, I showed you who the protagonists were for Vatican II. These were the protagonists in Salem. So anybody recognize any of these guys? I'm not sure if you can really see it, but let me see someone who's... Helder Câmara, yes? He was the Bishop of Brazil. You might remember him for what he's known to have said. He said, why is it that when I say, oh my goodness, there's poor people and I want to give bread to the poor people, they call me a saint. But when I ask, why are there poor people, they call me a communist, right? So, Helder Câmara. Sergio Méndez Arceso, he was the Bishop of Cuernavaca in Mexico. Very progressive. It was during a time when, remember, maybe some of you from the older generation remember that we weren't allowed to affiliate with Protestants. Do you remember we weren't allowed to go to their church service? And God forbid we'd read their Bible. Like that was not allowed, right? Well, we weren't even given the Bible at the time, right? In that generation, right? Remember that? Well, he wanted to get the Bible in the hands of the people, so he asked the Pope for permission to hand out the Protestant Bibles, because the Catholics didn't have Bibles at the time. That was, for the public, right? So he was very advanced that way. And of course, I'm sure everybody knows who Gustavo Gutierrez is, right? The father of liberation theology. Yes? Okay. Next. Now, there were people who were also excluded from the council, right? But they managed to slip some notes in, right, to their fellow bishops, right? Let's see if you recognize any of these guys. Do you know who Samuel Ruiz is? The Bishop of Chiapas? Okay. Leonardo Buff, the Buff brothers, okay? They were there. Sobrino, do you know? Yes, Father Sobrino from El Salvador. I think those are some of the people you would know. Enrique Dussel, very famous scholar, historian. Sometimes we hear about these guys, but we don't have a face to their name, and I think it's important to see who they were, right? Next. Okay. Karl Rahner was there at the council. Karl Rahner is another famous scholar and theologian. And in his opinion, the Vatican Council meeting defined Catholicism anew in terms of, next, a worldwide organization which understood itself now as in the world, for the world, and with the world. I want to repeat that. In the world, for the world, and with the world. Embracing the various peoples and cultures of the globe, its pluriform political and economic structures, and their different worldviews. This embarked Catholicism in an epoch-making transition, right? We're talking a major transition here, right? So I believe today, next, that we're in the midst of experiencing the challenges of this epochal transition once again. And to be faithful to our Catholic heritage in this particular time means, I think, what I call depth engagement. Depth engagement with human diversity on the one hand, and a rigorous study of ecological and environmental responsibility vis-a-vis the natural world on the other. Next. And it is with this reality of the modern world that the Church, united in council, wanted to enter into contact, reaffirming her awareness of being the sacrament of Christ in the light of the nations, putting herself in the devout listening, and recognizing the joys, pains of the people. This listening, this contact, is super important. You know, one of the former Jesuit superiors, Father Kovenbach, once told us at the university that it wasn't enough just to have content. You have study content, great, right? To understand context, the context of where you are. The church looks very different maybe in the Philippines than it does here, right? But he also said a third thing: content, context, and contact, right? That we have to have contact with people. Ideas alone do not change people. Engaging people at an intimate, personal level does, right? Okay. In a document, so I sort of summarized Vatican II. I talked a little bit about Gaudium et Spes and how it extended, you know, if we're talking about a global church, let's see what the global church's contribution is to the tradition. And now I want to come to today. Some of you might have seen or have read the document that came out from the U.S. Catholic bishops, the National Synthesis of the People of God in the United States of America for the diocesan phase of 2001 to 2003. I'm talking about the synod process, the synodal process. Did you participate in the synodal process? Okay. Well, Bishop Daniel Flores, chairman of the Committee on Doctrine, he stated that the document is, quote, the culmination of 10 months of intentional listening throughout the church in the U.S. and an attempt to synthesize and contextualize the common joys, hopes, sound familiar? Joys, hopes, but they add, and wounds called forth with the help of the Holy Spirit in the unfolding of the synod. They did what? They said what? Right? They're talking about wounds. They're admitting that they have been participating or part of these injuries. Well, what is of direct relevance in this document for our theme is this enduring wounds that they talk about, right? And they mentioned 4 wounds. Right. The first, you know when to turn it before I tell you. That's great. The first is, of course, the clergy sexual abuse and its cover-up by bishops, which not only has eroded trust in the hierarchy and the moral integrity of the church, but also has created a culture of fear, inhibiting people's relationship with one another. You know, trust is a very fragile thing, right? It takes a long time to build, you know, and once it's ruptured, you really have to be actively engaged to build that up slowly. The second wound that they talk about is the ongoing effects of the COVID pandemic, which exasperated people's feeling of being alone and isolated, and prevents people from coming together as a community to worship. The third is a deep division in the church, notably the lack of unity among the American bishops and even the open opposition of some bishops to Pope Francis and his reform agenda, which really is a source of great scandal. Sometimes, you know, we talk about the need for healing and reconciliation, and what we don't realize is that within our own tradition, our own church, if you look at a continuum between what's called the conservative Catholics and progressive Catholics, there's so much division, right? And we really need to take a look at that and see how we can try to bring these people together and teach them a way of speaking with one another where they don't take their ball and go home, you know, or just judge you and clonk you on the head. The fourth is the marginalization of groups of people from the church, such as those lacking social and economic power, the poor, the immigrants, the undocumented, the minorities, the homeless, the incarcerated, people with disabilities, people with mental health issues, addicted people, the LGBT community, people remarried without an annulment, people not married in the church, and I can go on and on and on. How are we ministering to these people? How are we bringing them home, right? You know, home is like, you know, you knock on the door, they have to let you in, right? So how do we let them in? These wounds, clergy sex abuse, pandemic, polarization, marginalization, says the document, quote, have exposed a deep hunger for healing and the strong desire for communion, community, a sense of belonging, and being united. You know, as a theologian, I cannot shy away from some real tensions and problems in relationship to the institutional church. Though we share the same faith foundation, there's often a tension between the pastoral judgments of bishops when exercising their legitimate function as teachers for the church, and the critical, exploratory function of Catholic theology in its service to the church, the academy, and the wider public. So once again, I say that faith must be appropriated over and over and over again, and this appropriation happens in a process which wrestles to own it and to deepen it. The past is meant to be instructive, not imprisoning, right? This means new symbols, new formulations must be discovered. Next. The church does not, we who are church do not exist for ourselves, but for the world. Now, I don't pretend to speak as an expert on, political matters, nor as a theologian who would theoretically relate faith to politics, but I speak to you as a woman of faith, as your sister in Christ, pained by the conflict that we find in the world, and yet one who chooses to believe more in the light than in the darkness. Next. Human beings, while capable of the worst, and I've seen the worst in my own work, are also capable of rising above themselves. So I believe in resilience, right? Choosing again what is good, making a new start, despite their mental and social conditioning. No system can completely suppress our openness to what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, or our God-given ability to respond to God's grace at work that is deep in our hearts. So I appeal to everyone throughout the world not to forget this dignity which is ours. Next. It should be noted also that another Vatican II document I just want to not forget about, the Decree on the Apostolic of the Laity, is an important companion document to what we've been talking about, in particular Gaudium et Spes. Why? Because it is particularly the laity, right, responsibility to carry out this Constitution's teaching, since the field of their apostolic action is precisely the world, right? You are in the world. We are in the world, right? We have to believe in the power of our religious imagination. And ours is stronger than those who would dominate or destroy. The real war is between our imagination, that is, what we know is possible and desired by the God of life. My favorite expression in Spanish of God is Dios de la vida por quien se vive, the God of life for whom we live. You know? What we can see and what we are blinded to. Our faith provides us with dreams and the awesome power of the human imagination to sustain life and reclaim the living through the simple will to believe. So we yearn for a world that is peaceful because we've seen with our own eyes the human cost of war and violence. We yearn for a world where the basic right of every person to a life of dignity is honored. You know, I've accompanied too many communities where that's not the reality. And we have observed too many political and, yes, ecclesial leaders without the vision or the courage to make it so. We can't be waiting for them, right? We have to do our part. Something, anything, but something. I myself have been deeply influenced by the Church of the Poor and the Martyrs, especially in Latin America. I was in El Salvador. I did take testimony of the survivors of the Chi massacre in Guatemala in '83. I've been in Nicaragua. One of the reasons I became a therapist is because when I was a young missioner, all my parishioners started to disappear. I was like, what the hell? What's going on? Right? So that led me down that track. Next. But I learned a great deal from Monsignor Romero. And this is one of the, I love his sermons. If you ever get his book of sermons, they're just beautiful reflections. He goes, it's very easy, he said, to be servants of the word without disturbing the world. A very spiritualized word, a word without any commitment to history, a word that can sound in any part of the world because it belongs to no part of the world. A word like that creates no problems and starts no conflict. Right? So in the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s, I learned and continue to learn that the encounter with the poor and the marginalized holds essential truth. The Word of God urges us to conversion, a turn, a shift, a change of heart. And Christian faith does not separate us from the world, but rather submerges us into it. The world in which we live and proclaim this faith in the God of life is a world, as Romero stated in the 80s, next, where the church would betray its own love for God and its fidelity to the gospel if it stopped being a defender of the rights of the poor, a humanizer of every legitimate struggle to achieve a more just society that prepares the way for the true reign of God in history. He also said that when the church hears the cry of the oppressed, it cannot but denounce the social structures that give rise to and perpetuate the misery from which the cry arises. We should feel indignation when things like this happen. Indignation, right? Indignation, where the poor of our country are daily oppressed by economic and political structures. We don't have a homeless problem. We have a housing problem, right? Even how we frame the problem, or the question becomes really important. So in our midst, there still exist those who sell the just person for money, the poor person for a pair of sandals. So that in our tradition, remember, whenever there's a crisis, go back to the founding documents. The revelatory words of the prophets of Israel are still applicable in our country. They're not just texts that we need and we read throughout the liturgical calendar. They are daily realities whose cruelty and intensity we live on a daily basis. We live them. Our sisters and brothers across the globe live them. Mothers and wives captured, disappeared, raped. Mutilated bodies appear in cemeteries. Those who struggle for justice and peace. When we allow the darkness to still the pulse of our compassion and mercy. Now, I know we talk about social justice a lot, but what we don't tell people is that if you're committed to justice, you need to know you have to be in for the long haul. You may never see the fruits of your work. And if that's the case, then you need to have some kind of practice to sustain you, right? Prayer, meditation, community. You're not meant to do this alone, right? Hence the importance of solidarity. And again, as Monsignor reminds us, next, he asks us to be truly a good Samaritan. The other part of our tradition that speaks to us, of course, is the Jesuit tradition, right? Our Jesuit tradition also echoes this commitment, right? During these turbulent times, they write, years, the Society of Jesus, too, was also undergoing dramatic transformation. The 31 General Congregation in 65, under the leadership of Padre Arupe, initiated a vast regard to working for justice. The new orientation was confirmed by the next General Congregation in 75 by committing Jesuits to, quote, the service of faith and the promotion of justice, right? So here, these are parts of the strands of our tradition, right? We've got the Vatican, we've got the pastoral teachings of the church, we've got the lived experience, the living texts if you will. We have the Jesuits, right? Next. We have the Jesuit martyrs and their companions, right? Again, I've been very influenced by Sobrino and Ignacio Ellacuría, who was one of the martyrs. To understand the importance of Jesus' death, Ignacio Ellacuría told us, the church must raise in every age 2 questions. 1, where is the crucified Jesus to be found today? With whom is he identified? Ellacuría's answer is with the crucified peoples, right? How many of you are familiar with this phrase, the crucified peoples? It's not enough to come to the church, stand before the cross, right, and pray, but rather to get the crucified people off the cross, right? And how do we do that? Note that he does not say simply suffering people. This is really important. He's not just talking about suffering people, he's talking about crucified people, right? Crucifixion is not just suffering, right, owing to our finite or even sinful condition. Rather, it is suffering unjustly inflicted, maintained, and perpetuated through socio-economic and religious systems, those who would profit from this suffering. Do you all understand what I'm saying with that? Right? They didn't hatch that way. They were crucified, right? So what are the systems and the structures, the beliefs that crucify people, right? And we need to get them off the cross. Francis speaks of a new chapter of evangelization. He writes, quote, I always like to hide behind Pope Francis. He says, I dream of a missionary option, that is, a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today. Right? These are truly momentous moments. Oh, end of quote. These are truly momentous words which make a Copernican revolution in the church's self-understanding and its mission. The church must not exist for its own sake, I say this again, but for the world. Francis describes this church that goes forth in deeply personal terms. He says, quote, I prefer a church that is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it's been out on the streets, rather than a church that is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I do not want a church, he says, with being at the center and which then ends by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures. If something should rightly disturb us and trouble our consciousness, he says, it is the fact that so many of our brothers and sisters are living without the strength, without the light, without the consolation born of friendship with Christ, without a community of faith to support them, without meaning and its goal in life. More than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within structures that give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits that make us feel safe, while at our door, people are starving. And Jesus does not tire of saying to us, give them something to eat. Give the people bread, not stone. All right? So, and finally, I drew from the Vatican Council, I drew from the documents, I drew from Salem, the lived experience, and now I finally end with the Sense Fidelium, the faith of the people. Next. I'm not going to be able to see this very well, but I was involved in the Encuentro process, which was a listening process among the Spanish-speaking of this country. And they came up with this brochure, but I love this one. It says, una iglesia pobre, a church, una iglesia pobre, a poor church. Remember Francis says he wants a poor church, right? So a church that is poor, that, if it doesn't have a church, then we meet in houses. If it doesn't have a bell, then we rely on the guitar of a young person, of a youth. That if someone needs help, they would ask, so that every home becomes a church, every voice becomes a bell, and every hand becomes 100 hands. Beautiful, no? So again, it is the isolation of the struggle. Let me repeat that. It is the isolation of the struggle that wears us down. It wears us down. We cannot and are not meant to do life alone. And so with that, I leave you. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you later.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez. We are definitely not alone. We are few, but we are mighty, to quote Father John Whitney. We will now take a short break. We're going to accept questions from our live and online audiences. Those of you who are here in the church or over at From, you may fill out your questions on the cards that you received. If you need a card, raise your hand. We can hand them out to you. Those of you online, please type any questions you may have for Dr. Rodriguez in the chat. We apologize in advance that due to time, we probably won't get to every question. When we return, Dr. Rodriguez will be joined by Dr. Aaron Brigham, Executive Director for the Joan and Ralph Lane Center for Catholic Social Thought and the Ignatian Tradition, and affiliate faculty in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at the University of San Francisco. Dr. Brigham earned her PhD in Systematic and Philosophical Theology from the Graduate Theological Union in 2010, when she began teaching at USF in the areas related to Catholic theology and social thought. The focus of her doctoral work was on contemporary Catholic ecclesiology in conversation with critical theory and feminist theology. Her current research and teaching focuses on the social teaching and theology of Pope Francis, the sanctuary movement, and the intersections of race, gender, and poverty in Catholic social thought. We will be back in a few minutes to enjoy stimulating conversation between these amazing women. Stay with us.
Jeanette, just wanted to thank you for your words, for bringing us back to the council, the significance of the council, but really expanding, I think, and bringing us to today and how we can talk about the significance of the council on theology. On theology, the impact of the council on theology, and also on our way of being church. So I have a few questions. The first one, I was really struck when you brought us to the U.S. Bishop's report on the Synod and how they used the language echoing Gaudium et Spes, the joys, the anxieties, but the wounds. And using that language of wounds, it made me think of Pope Francis, right? And how he talks about, and you brought this back, right? That he wants a wounded church, a church that's been wounded by the world, right? And he also wants a field hospital church, right? That heals the wounds, that goes out and heals the deepest wounds. I'm thinking about this, right? The kinds of the church, the wounded church that he wants, right? That's had our hearts broken from being in the world. It's different, right, from the wounds that the bishops named, those wounds that were named in the synodal process, the wounds of division and exclusion. So, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. This kind of woundedness, where do you see, or do you see, places of healing, or what might that healing look like, so that we can be that wounded church that Pope Francis, right, the church that's wounded by the world, not by each other.
So I'm not clear. So what is the question, though?
Yeah, where do you see healing of this church, right? Those kinds of wounds, the wounds of division, the wounds of exclusion. Can't hear me.
So I unfortunately think that the institutional church, right, will take a lot longer to do its own therapy, to do its own healing, right? Yeah. I think the people of God church, when we think of different models of church, right? The people of God church, I think know that healing is necessary. And I think they're trying to find ways, right, to come together, right? Either, more and more lay people are doing spiritual direction and looking for spiritual direction. More and more people are forming book clubs, but it's like spiritual reading book club. I mean, so they're trying, to find those spaces, that will bring healing, belonging, unity, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I don't think they've given up on the institutional church, but I do think a lot of them are holding on with their fingernails, right? And I do think that there is a possibility that the church as we know it institutionally will not be the same as what we know. Yeah. But like Monsignor Romero said, even if he died, the church would continue in the people. Yeah. I really believe that it will continue in the people. I was just talking to, I think it was Father Gregory earlier this evening, saying that, I have a lot of friends who are former practicing Catholics. Yeah. And I tell them that's okay because it's in their DNA, and it will resurface at key moments in their life. And it does, So I have a friend who, he and I went to Ephesus, right, to Turkey. And we went to visit the House of Mary. And so this is a house that thousands upon thousands of people have come and prayed, and there's candles, and there's something about spaces change when people pray in them. And he walked in and he started crying. And he said, I don't know why I'm crying. And I said, it's because it's in your DNA, you're Catholic, right? And we let's see, are not limited to the cognitive or to words. Our tradition has lifted up the artists and the poets and the musicians, right, who tap into something, right? And I think it's the poets and the musicians and the artists who have brought and bring healing to the people that have been hurt, right? I'm thinking, for example, of Dan Schutt, for example, and his music, how the impact that's had on people, right? Yeah. So I think that, like anything, we talk about healing and reconciliation, and I think there's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I could forgive you if you hurt me, whether you ask me to forgive you or not. But that doesn't mean we're going to reconcile, right? But forgiveness is possible. But that's not reconciliation. Reconciliation is you have to admit you did something wrong, right? And then I come back in with you, right? So I do think that we have to create those kind of spaces.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to hold this, and maybe this will be better. Is this better?
I think so.
Great. No, I love that, calling us back to, who is the church, right? The church is the people of God, right? So often, like, students will ask, right, well, the church teaches this, or, right, and it's like, well, we're the church, right? This is the church. This question, I think, is related. I think that this is a group for whom several of us, are kind of holding on with nails. So you talked about, and I really appreciated when you talked about the exclusion of women at Vatican II, right? But also the impact, right? Which I think is really important. Jeanette just contributed to a volume that I edited on women engaging Catholic social thought. It's a great book. It just came out. But a lot of it was about that, right? Recognizing the ways that women's voices, women's experiences have been excluded, but recognizing the impact and the way that we've shaped the Catholic social tradition.
And what I like about that, I apologize. What I like about that is that women have not allowed the patriarchy or the clericalism to remove them from their commitment to the church, right? That they know it's there, they know they they sort of second-class citizens, but it doesn't, but it's their church and they're not going anywhere, right? And I think that's very powerful.
Yeah.
And the reality is, if women just for one day decided to go on strike in the church around the world, I think it would have an interesting impact, don't you think? Yeah, I think so.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what would it be like if women who work in the church went on strike? So this group was specifically lifted up in the bishop's document too. Women who work in the church who feel underappreciated and underpaid, and I'm thinking of that group, right? Like working in the church, like, bringing their kids to church, like, and still believing in the church, and how hard that is to not have the full authority, right? When we come up against those limitations that we see in the writing of the documents, right? At Vatican II, but today still, right? And so I'm just wondering, if you can talk a little bit more about, like, how do we hold both? Sorry, I apologize. How do we hold both that impact and exclusion today? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I want to make a distinction between, I don't think that their faithfulness is around the church. I think their faithfulness is towards the gospel, right? And that's why I always say, whenever there's a crisis, go back to the founding documents, right? Is the church, models of the church, right? Institutional church. Is it really the church that they're being faithful to? Or is it because the church holds the repository of this wisdom, of the gospel, of the Christ? And so that, yes, they recognize the injustice, they recognize the exclusion. And so you have to ask yourself, well, then why don't they just leave? And some do, and understandably, but many don't. Why? So what keeps them? I think sometimes we ask the wrong question, right? It's like, what keeps them there? That's what we want to get to. Those are the gems that we want to get to. What is so valuable to them that they would still come even when they're not being fed, right? I want to know. Right? And I think among them, if you talk to them, you will find mystics, prophets, and teachers. Right?
Yeah.
And what I said earlier about being in for the long haul. Right? They may never see the fruits of their work for them. Right? But in the long haul, they hope that will happen for their children. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, thank you for that.
Plus, the other thing I want to say is that, Latino Catholics are very different than Anglo-Catholics. Anglo-Catholics pay a lot of attention to the institutional church, and I should probably not put this on YouTube, but the Latino church basically says, sí, padre, yes, father, and then they do what they want, right? Is that true, fathers? Right? We're like, we love our priests, don't get me wrong. We love our priests, we want them to accompany us, but if they don't, it's like, okay, sí, padre. The American church listens more than Rome does to some of the proclamations that come out.
Well, and that's interesting, anecdotally. I remember back when there was buzz around this synod, and I was late to learn about it, which, I shouldn't have been, right? But my friends from South and Central America, right, they knew about it and were so excited about it and saw the possibility in it before I did. And I think that is, it's a different way of being church, that more synodal way of being church. It is a different experience for me, I think for a lot of us that participated, but it's not necessarily
No,
new.
Latinos in the Catholic Church in the United States went through 5 encuentro processes, 5 what you would call synodal processes. We call them encuentros, right, encounters. We had 5 before you had your first, right, where we gather the people, we listen to the people, we lift up with the people, what's important to the people, right? Yeah.
One more question?
Okay.
So this is about Catholic social teaching specifically, because, and you make this, you pointed this out so beautifully in your talk, the impact of Gaudium et Spes on Catholic social teaching, not only in the content, because they're certainly in the content of the social issues that it addressed, but in the methodology, right, of reading the signs of the times and how important that's been in Catholic social teaching and teaching Catholic social teaching. And also in the synodal report, one phrase was lifted up that I often hear, right, you often hear, that Catholic social teaching is the best kept secret of the church. And I think there's something to that. But I'm also wondering, and I think this might connect to how you were talking about Archbishop Romero and the disruptive word versus the comfortable word, right? Pope Francis, in his address to the World Gathering of Popular Movements, talked about how some people in the church are annoyed with me when I talk about the preferential option for the poor, the common good, solidarity, but I'm going to keep talking, right? But that got me wondering: is it the best kept secret, or is it something else? Is there another barrier there to really knowing about Catholic social teaching and living Catholic social teaching?
Okay, so a couple of strands come to mind. So first of all, it's like feminism. Latin American feminism is based in social movements. Doesn't start with theoretical, right? It starts with the lived experience social movements. So methodologically, it's a different approach, if you will. Number two, I think in the United States, historically, there's always been, let me put it this way. So the role of the bishop, as I understand it, is unity, right? So if you think, and this was a struggle Monsignor Romero had, right? Because he started off in a very traditional way, wanting unity. But in that context, where people were being massacred, he had to take a stand, right? And that's what got him in trouble, right? Both in Rome, with his other priests, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the Catholic social teaching the principles of Catholic social teaching have already existed and were in play, if you will, before the document of Catholic social teaching was written. I mean, go back to, Vera Navarra, on labor, right? So I think that it's been in the tradition there, but then somebody kind of brought it together and compiled it, right? So a number of things. So one strand is this tension between being in the world and not of the world, right? Still kind of a little bit of the residues are there. I think people are afraid to get politically involved, although if you're of this world, then you have to engage social systems and structures, so it makes sense, right, to do that. I know as a liberation theologian, when I teach Latin American liberation theology, my students very much like to get into the political and the social, right? And Jesus was political, and I'm like, no, Jesus was not political. But there are political implications to the gospel, right? And when you do something of service in the world, it has to be grounded in faith. Otherwise, then it becomes political, right? So I think the reason it's a best kept secret, right, is because people don't want to open up Pandora's box, right? Because imagine if we would take seriously the principles of Catholic social teaching in every aspect, every sector of our life, how transformative that could be. So who wants to give that and put in people's hands, right? Although, why isn't the gospel enough? So we have to keep saying it over and over again in different ways, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I love that. It just goes back to that, one of the things you said that I wrote down, that we underestimate the power of our religious imagination. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Just remember, again, and people have no sense of history, like they'll say, what has the church done lately? I go, well, in the early 19th century, we did the hospitals and the orphanages and the schools and the soup kitchens. It was the Catholic, specifically it was the sisters who did that, by the way, right? So, yeah, you look like you're ready.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to questions from the audience, if that's all right. Okay, I'm going to move this over here. Okay, so some of these are from the live audience and some of these are from the chat. I'm actually going to have Sister Teresa Mosier start with reading some of the questions.
Okay. I'm freezing.
Okay, here's one to start. Assuming for this question that those who are marginalized from the Catholic Church are crucified people, how do we get them off the cross without significant systemic institutional change?
So I'm sorry, how do we get them off the cross, and what was after that?
How do we get them off the cross without significant systemic institutional change?
Right, we don't. We don't.
Okay, that was an easy one.
That was easy. Sorry? Oh, you're starting me off easy. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Should I be
Okay.
concerned?
In a world of moral relativism, how does the church provide a sense of stability in the 21st century, securing strong positions on issues?
How does the church provide civility?
Stability, a sense of stability in the 21st, securing strong positions on issues in a world of moral relativism.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure what that means. Can you ask it differently?
I think the issue here is there's a lot of changes going on, with the doctrine and all the rest of it that you talked about. These are big changes from what we had before. And in the context of that, it's kind of everybody has different ideas about what should or should not do, or no ideas at all, or whatever. Or they just go off on, I like this, I like that. So how does the church provide a sense of stability in the 21st century, taking strong positions on issues so that people have some guidance, I think is the idea.
Okay, so I think those are two different questions, but okay. So let me give it a minute. Just give me a minute. So again, remember I said that we have a 2,000-year repository of wisdom, right? And I'm not talking about just treatises or theological constructs. I'm talking about the saints, right? And the prophets, right? And the reformers, right? And the people who have had an impact socially with institutions. I think that, first of all, again, in a time of crisis, go back to the founding documents, to go back to the gospel, right? But I also think that what we might be able to provide is what we did provide at one time, which is formation, right? For me, one of the saddest things to happen is to see all the Catholic schools closed down. Because, I was a project kid from New York. My parents were immigrants. They only had a 6th and 8th grade education. There were 7 of us, 9 of us counting my parents. And if it wasn't for the sisters who invested in kids like me, I wouldn't be here, right? So it was to move beyond the platitude, the moral platitude, if you will, and to really, put your money where your mouth is, right? And to follow the money. I mean, what did Jesus say? Where you put your time and your money, that's where your heart is, right? So where is our heart, right? Where are we investing, right? And I'm a firm believer that this country, this church, our universities will rise or fall on the commitments and the investments that we make in our young people, in our minorities, right? Who are not minorities. They're minoritized, but they're the majority. In case no one knows, the church is being held up by the global south, right? And so where are these investments? Where are these venues to share the faith with people? And starting at high school, I think, is already late. We got to start younger. Why don't we have preschool Bible study, whatever? Our Protestant brothers and sisters have it way over us, right? They have camps, they have Bible study, they have preschool, right? So I think we need to rethink the formation. I think we've been too much an adult church and a cognitive church, right? And we have to go back and reclaim the wealth of our tradition, which, once again, are the artists and the musicians and the mathematicians and the scientists, right? So I think that a big part of the transformation needs to, I want to look at the sisters. The sisters, they're just incredible. I mean, the sisters who are aging, right? And there's fewer and fewer, and they're in these big convents, right? What do? They don't sell their building and go move in a condo or shut down. They reinvent themselves. So now you have convents that rent out rooms to college students for a cheaper price than what some of these cities charge. Or they'll start childcare centers for working mothers so that they can work. It is in those kind of actions that you teach the most, right? And that you form a sense of morality, right? And a civility, because you're responding to the needs of the people, right? There's some very creative things that we could be doing as church, as institutional church, to embrace the people and give them hope once again.
Thank you. One more.
very strongly
How
about
can
that.
we implement context, and contact in addressing both church division and societal injustice?
How do I use those three terms for that? What was the first part?
How can we implement content, context,
Yeah.
and contact? I think these are your words.
Yes.
In addressing both church divisions and societal injustice.
Okay.
It's a big one.
Yeah. So I'm gonna answer by telling you the story. So I teach at a Jesuit Catholic university, and one of my colleagues was a lawyer in the law school, and he was a libertarian, right? And we were having this discussion, and he got me mad about something, and I said, on a good day, I don't even think a libertarian belongs on a Jesuit Catholic university, right? And his response to me was, well, then why did you invite me to be part of this commission or something or other? And I said, because we're a Jesuit Catholic university. Because our tradition, the medievals really got it right? I mean, we started in the monastery, then we moved to the university, and they really had it right. I'm talking about, Origins and Justin and Tertullian, the ancients, right? The ancient fathers of the faith. And they used to say that you really didn't have your weight in salt unless you were able to, and the Jesuits teach us this too, be able to argue the opponent's point of view, right? By arguing the opponent's point of view, you've just expanded your own epistemological position, right? And you need that dialogue. We need to be dialoguing with people we don't agree with, right? What does the faith tell us? It's no sweat to love somebody who loves you back or agrees with you. But that's not what Jesus asked us to do. Jesus asked us to love our enemies. Try loving somebody whose name I shall not mention. But, try to love somebody you totally disagree with, right? And yet that's exactly what we're being asked to do. Mm-hmm. It's there. We have it in our teachings, right? It's not something new, it's something we have to come up with, right? We just have to have people who have the formation and the skills to be able to facilitate that.
Thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. This concludes our program for the evening.
Okay.
So thank you all for coming. Thank you to everyone online who watched, and we look forward to seeing you again December 1st, same time, same place, 6:30 Thursday, with Bradford Heinz, who will be speaking on Lumen Gentium, and we will see you then. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.